Hello, this is Dan at Sonicstate, and today I am going to look at how to set up a generative piece within Ableton Live by using some MIDI effects and the Wave Junction synthesizer plugin. But first of all, credit what it's due. The main techniques shown in this video come from an old web tutorial by Ableton user Angstrom. Check it out at his website. I am not going to get into too much detail for all the MIDI effects, but rather focus on the essentials. There are three main elements in this live session. A one-note MIDI clip that loops continuously, one or more MIDI effects racks which contain a series of MIDI effects, and a sound source inside an instrument rack. In this case, I have used Wave Junction. This structure is the same in all the tracks, so let's start by looking at one of them as an example. As you can see, there is just a MIDI note inside the clip. Any note will work, although you probably want to use one that falls within the range of your chosen instrument. Setting the loop length and the session BPM will give you the desired density of notes for your chosen style. Now let's have a look at the MIDI effects rack. First, we have a random device which receives the MIDI note from the clip and randomly generates a variety of MIDI notes. Then we have a scale device which maps any incoming notes to the chosen scale. Next, we get into the velocity device. This is the key element in the session. It functions as a MIDI filter or gate by accepting some MIDI notes and rejecting others depending on their velocity. To do this, the device has to be in gate mode. So, for example, the first velocity device is set to receive all possible velocities, as defined by the input range values. In this case, it is receiving only one velocity value from the MIDI note in the clip. Then we are using the random knob to output those MIDI notes with randomized velocity values. If I bypass all other MIDI effects, the result is a continuous series of MIDI notes with different velocities. The second velocity device is the one that functions more like a MIDI filter. If I decrease the range value, the amount of notes played will be reduced. This is because some of the randomized velocities sent from the previous device will fall out of range, and thus will be ignored by the second velocity device. So in effect, we are playing with probability values. I can also map the range parameter to a macro control or automate it over time to increase or decrease the chances of a certain instrument being played, but more on this later. I am going to ignore the second nested MIDI effects rack for the sake of clarity, although we'll have a look at it in a moment. So after the MIDI effects rack, it comes the instrument rack, which provides the sound source. In this case, it is the Wave Junction synthesizer. However, we can still insert further MIDI effects just before the instrument to filter or manipulate the incoming MIDI even more. In this case, there is a velocity device to add an extra MIDI filter for the bass, a pitch device to transpose the notes an octave, and another scale device to make sure everything is harmonically consistent. The last velocity device does not function as a gate, but instead outputs a high enough velocity value for the bass to be heard. Okay, so now that we have the basics in place, we can look at the nested MIDI effects rack. There are several chains inside this rack. Each one of these chains has a velocity device with a different input range, so each one accepts a different range of velocities. and then it manipulates incoming MIDI in a certain way depending on the MIDI effects it contains. So for example, you can transpose, randomize, or add chords. The combination of chains and the velocity device function as a branching mechanism and adds complexity and variety to the generative process. You can also insert a MIDI effects rack inside an instrument rack and set it to play a variety of melodies or arpeggios. So for example, in the drop lead track, if I open the MIDI rack, we can see there are several chains. And if we click on every chain, we can see the velocity devices followed by a series of MIDI effects, which generate different melodies. Notice how the velocity devices have different input ranges that do not cross over. This is to avoid playing two of the melodies at the same time. I am going to switch off some of the previous velocity devices so that we get more notes through and see more clearly what's going on. You could take this idea as far as you want, nesting several MIDI effects racks inside each other and setting up different conditions on every chain and velocity device, etc. Another important aspect in generative music is about the level of control to shape the piece from the composer's point of view. One obvious solution is to map the input range parameter from the second velocity device onto a macro control. If we want more notes to go through, we increase the range, otherwise we decrease it. In this particular session, however, I have used clip automation instead of macro controls to shape the density of the arrangement. For each of the instruments, I have unlinked the velocity range envelope from the original loop length. Then I have increased the loop length, and then I have written an automation curve to increase or decrease the possibility of an instrument being played at a particular time. As a quick aside, Angstrom's original session used a slightly different approach. I am just going to open a session I made following his method. As you can see, there is only one track, which contains the MIDI effects rack and an instrument rack. Inside this instrument rack, there is a chain for each one of the Wave Junction instruments. In this session, you can control the density of the arrangement with a single knob, which is the velocity input range parameter from the second velocity plugin. This is certainly a more efficient approach, as it uses just one MIDI effects rack for all the instruments. This means that when you increase the velocity input range, you increase the chances of all the instruments at the same time. However, I wanted to be able to control the probability of every instrument separately. So I took the instruments out of the instrument rack and into their own individual tracks with their own MIDI effects rack and clip automation. Finally, last but not least, we have the Wave Junction synthesizer plugin. I find that this instrument's architecture and sound are well suited for experimentation and ambient sounds in general. I started by loading some of the factory presets, trying to achieve a palette of sounds that would work together. These include a couple of pad sounds, ambience, lead instruments, and a bass. Then I started to adapt them when required so that they fitted the arrangement better. For example, I had to make sure some instruments were in the correct frequency range and adjusted the tuning of the oscillators accordingly. I think I also changed some of the oscillators' source waves and changed some filters' cutoff frequencies. I also increased the number of voices to be able to play chords in a couple of instruments. And I generally used the modulation matrix to sculpt the sound and alter its internal movement so that it fitted the style of the piece. So for example, I turned off some of the filter modulation, I added auto panning to some sounds, I also increased the attack time of the main amplitude envelope on a few sounds, and changed the LFO sync rate. So Wave Function offers many possibilities for sound design, and if you add to this the power of generative MIDI, the unlinked envelope automation, more effect sense like delay, and Ableton's own audio devices like bit repeat and other audio processing effects, well, the possibilities are truly endless. I hope you have enjoyed this and it makes sense. See you next time.